Are we getting there? We are getting there. Welcome back, everyone. Yeah, I think the room is filling. Good. So I hope you all had a good coffee break after these interesting last two talks. We are going to continue this session with even more excitement today. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Kelly Widdicks from the University of Lancaster. Yeah, there's probably not much more introduction I have to do, right? So Kelly, the floor is yours, and tell us more about how to responsibly use the internet. Thanks a lot.
Okie dokes, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. So hi everyone, I'm Kelly Widdicks from Lancaster University. I'm delighted to be with you all here today at the SICT Doctoral Summer School. And apologies, I'm here virtually, but thank you for having me and for joining my talk. So the motivation of this event is all about ICT, sustainability, and its role in the climate emergency. And today's theme as part of that is on digital technology within constraints and the types of multidisciplinary research around that. And this is where my work to date has predominantly sit, focused within the field of human-computer interaction, or otherwise known as HCI. And at high level, I've been focusing on how we can design and innovate digital technology more sustainably and responsibly. So in this talk today, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the work I did for my PhD within sustainable HCI, and specifically on understanding and mitigating what we call internet demand or data demand, which I'll explain in more detail soon. So just to give you some context of my background very quickly, I'm working from home right now, but I'm usually based in the School of Computing and Communications at Lancaster University, which looks over this lovely countryside. I have a background in computer science from my undergraduate degree, some time as a software engineer in industry, and then I've done my PhD in sustainable HCI. Alina Eriksson, who I believe is talking next, was actually my external examiner, and she's an awesome researcher, so you're in for a great talk with her. And I've been spending the last few years as a postdoc in sustainability and computing, as well as gender equality and computer science education, and I recently got appointed as a lecturer at Lancaster to continue my work. And somewhere around here, I also attended a summer school like you all now. So it was the ICT for S1 actually, and it was super fun way to meet loads of people and exciting researchers in the field. So, and it's actually led to quite a few collaborations, one of which I'll be talking about today. So my advice is just to really enjoy this week and take as much out of it as you can. At Lancaster, I've been part of this awesome interdisciplinary group. So we have members from computing, the Environment Centre, and also sociology. And we've been working on issues of sustainability, such as thermal comfort, energy use across campus, food sustainability, social justice, and looking at how technology and specifically human-computer interaction plays a part in these issues. And these are all the great people in my team. So if you're aware of any of their work and wanting to speak to them, I'm happy to do an introduction. And my work specifically has focused on mitigating the impacts of the ICT itself on the environment. And I'm sure all the talks yesterday that you've heard a lot about these issues at play in regards to ICT's environmental impact. But I'll provide a quick kind of overview of why this is a problem within my research area of HCI. So in our everyday lives, at least from a European perspective, there are an abundance of technologies that we can access, such as games consoles, smart TVs, tablets, smartphones, etc. And with this growth of devices, there's also been a huge growth in online services and the demand for cloud infrastructure to make those devices more useful. And we increasingly embed these digital devices and online services into our everyday lives, such as for work, entertainment, and socializing. And these activities are all often now internet connected, especially in the last year with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has all led to a large growth in internet traffic, with the total world's traffic jumping from 2,000 gigabytes per second in 2007 to over 46,000 per second in 2017. So that's a huge increase. and this extreme growth is set to continue moving forward. And to meet such traffic increases and the ability to make sure that many people can access online services via a multitude of devices, there has to be a growth in the internet infrastructure, so data centres, communication networks, etc., to meet demand. And this growth is also added to by innovations in the infrastructure, which allow for higher bandwidth transmissions. So kind of move from 3G to 4G and now 5G, and also kind of fibre broadband to superfast broadband and fibre to the home. And all this growth has an environmental impact. So with ICT is expected to form around 2.1 to 3.9% of our global greenhouse gas emissions today, and emissions from ICT are likely to rise. And there's large debates on whether ICT's own emissions are a problem, given the sector heavily invests in renewable energy. Energy efficiencies have constantly been embedded to technology, and ICT can also create emissions reductions in other sectors. For example, video conferencing technologies could reduce air travel and may have done so during the pandemic. And I won't delve into that much debate too much today. Details about those arguments can be found in the report linked on the slide. But to put it simply, ICT has a carbon footprint, and every carbon footprint will matter if we are to reach global net zero emissions by 2050 in accordance with climate change targets in the Paris Agreement. And ICT growth trends tends to follow this thing called the Cornucopian paradigm. So it's discussed by Priest and co-authors at CHI in 2016. And this is whereby speed and efficiencies in the infrastructure enable new services, which create more affordances for users, which drives demand and therefore growth in the infrastructure again to meet this demand. So this kind of drives this kind of reinforcement feedback loop depicted by R on the diagram. And this growth is going to get much worse with the rise of ICT trends such as IoT, big data and AI. So rather, we need to target this demand and make sure that services are designed more sustainably so that we can stop this kind of reinforcement feedback loop and stop eliminating the energy efficiencies made in the infrastructure. So we need to break the Cornucopian paradigm. And this demand is what was coined data demand in 2015 by Lord and co-authors. So the demand for network connectivity and online services. And large-scale studies such as Sandvine and their Global Internet Phenomena Report can provide us with an overview of how data demand is formed, but there's only so much detail that these aggregate statistics reveal. So really we need to know about how data demand is formed in everyday life, kind of what services and devices are driving demand, how is this temporal and spatially composed, and how are users' activities transitioning in more data demanding directions. And given demand is driven by the design of digital devices and online services, how can we mitigate demand through human-computer interaction design, particularly in ways which work best for users? So there's work that's already been started to explore data demand in HCI. So Bates et al. In 2014 looked at the energy impacts of ICT, but only looked at data demand qualitatively. And Lord et al. Looked at the data demand of iOS devices through logging of tablets and phones, and qualitatively through interviews with the device owners. But prior work didn't look at data demand through time, by users' activities, or kind of quantitatively for devices other than mobiles. So this is roughly what I set out to investigate for my PhD research, and a large part of my results have come from a study that I conducted with households to find out more about their internet use and the variety of devices that they access in this space. So I'll just briefly introduce that study for some context. So we recruited 20 participants across 9 households, so it's quite a small study, between June 2017 and January 2018 in the UK. And these are the households that participated, depicted by the family tree structures for each of the 9 households. So this shows the pseudonyms, the sex, their age range and occupation for each participant and the relationships between them. And we had a range of families with younger and older children, age groups from younger than 10 to people in their 50s, and occupations such as financial sector employees, school students, and to retired workers. And to study their data demand, I conducted a mixed method study, which involved qualitative pre-study interviews with each participant to find out more about their device and online service use in everyday life. I then deployed these OpenWRT routers, which is super intrusive, but basically it logged everything that they did on the internet for a month. And this basically captured, we used NetFlow flows to understand the data size of transmissions, DNS requests, allowing us to uncover the names of services and websites accessed, and then DHCP requests to find out the names of household devices. I then took this data from the router study back to each of the participants and conducted another interview with them. And it was basically to find out kind of the different routines and irregularities around their internet use. So including plots of daily internet use by device, internet use throughout the week and peaks and troughs, and also lists of kind of like the main internet services that they access. In total, I logged 66 devices in the households, including smartphones, which were the most popular device, alongside other devices such as tablets, laptops, TV boxes, games consoles, etc. And I was able to uncover how these devices complement users' everyday activities through time, and particularly the data demanding activities that users carry out. And I won't go into too much detail here about the overall usage of data demand, because I can explain more detail about these in my thesis and papers, but I've selected a couple of main findings so that I can discuss these with you today. And I must stress that this work was all conducted before the pandemic, which has greatly shifted our day-to-day routines. So there will probably now be differences in how people use their devices and demand data to what my work found. So firstly, through the quantitative data, I was able to reveal the top categories of demand that we need to target. And these are watching, updates and installs, gaming, social networking, and communication. And this was particularly watching, as this forms 72% of the data demand from our households. And this is backed up by Cisco, who also revealed that 72% of global consumer traffic is for watching. So we need to target this activity most significantly. Secondly, through the qualitative data of the households, I was able to understand how this data demand is formed within these categories. But these conversations highlighted that there are aspects about internet use that participants didn't like. So, for example, the overuse of services due to their addictive designs, as Ben describes as impulse actions taking you down a rabbit hole, which would affect his work productivity. And actually, quite a few of the participants would practice reducing internet use for reasons of well-being, family relationships, privacy, and work productivity, not necessarily sustainability, like my motivation for this research. So this led to this idea of designing for sufficient internet use. So moderating internet use to reduce data demand while still supporting interactions that users find most meaningful. I positioned that this would not only improve data usage in terms of sustainability, but it would also support users' digital well-being, work productivity, and relationships with others. So the kind of more social aspects of computing as people spend less time online. So from the analysis, which I recognise I've only just briefly talked about, there were two main areas where I found data demand reductions to have the most potential. Firstly, for watching, requiring more exploration for targeting how we might reduce data demand for that data-intensive activity. And secondly, to better understand how we might design for sufficiency through moderate and meaningful digital experiences. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on these two areas of research, and I'll start with watching. So from exploring the quantitative and qualitative data from the household router study in more detail, I uncovered that the new norms of watching that we might need to target that are making this practice more intensive, more data intensive. And from the quantitative data, it became apparent that YouTube is a significant data demanding service. In fact, it formed around 50% of watching data demand in the households. And this is backed up by larger scale studies, as Sandvine also found YouTube to be a significant internet traffic category for Europe. So looking at this data usage by device and participant, it was particularly prominent for younger generations, entertainment and learning. And looking by activity, it was often used for listening to music. And this has also been found in other work and is obviously a much more data intensive way to listen to music by streaming video. Users are also becoming more concentrated on their own screens. So for example, many people now media multitask, which might mean using your mobile phone to browse Facebook whilst also watching TV. Yet I also found that people were beginning to partake in multi-watching, which I try to create with my family here. But basically users are becoming more focused on their own streamed content. And this even happened in the same room for my participants, where someone might be watching something on their mobile device, whilst someone else might be watching something on TV. And Ofcom actually found that a third of UK households do this multi-watching in the same room. And streamed content wasn't always meaningful to some of the participants, and this actually happened with YouTube in particular. So for example, the participants might watch YouTube just to pass the time or fall asleep. And this suggests that internet traffic that some users demand is somewhat wasted, as it's not fully appreciated. And from these norms, I suggested ways in which we might mitigate watching demand. For example, there's kind of some low-hanging fruit options for HCI. So we might reduce data demand in HCI by encouraging standard definition viewing instead of high definition by making this the default stream. And it's worth noting that the BBC iPlayer, for example, already embeds this type of design. We might even encourage people to watch together rather than this trajectory of users becoming more focused on their own devices and services, such as a group-only on-demand streaming service. And there's also the potential to co-create what streaming is enough to reduce the streaming that users don't find meaningful, but still enable the streams that kind of bring them in enjoyment, entertainment, and learning. We can work more closely with network engineers to consider how less demanding forms of watching can be prompted for and to preempt HCI services designs network effects. So for example, Facebook introducing autoplay puts a lot of strain on network operators to meet peak demand. So we could actually investigate the potential impact that a design changes could have by collaborating with network engineers and utilising their networking expertise. And this will help determine whether design is data and environmentally friendly before that service and update hits the market. And thirdly, we might have to adapt the pricing of more data-intensive usage of services to better reflect their environmental cost, which obviously contravenes with net neutrality, but for reasons of the environment rather than profit, which is what net neutrality laws usually protect. And this is where it gets really tricky, because sustainable innovation could therefore conflict with other themes of responsible innovation if these types of issues were not addressed appropriately. So for example, if more data-intensive services such as streaming services should be more expensive for reasons of environmental sustainability, then we would need all streaming services to have the same pricing strategy to make sure that one business could not benefit over another. We would also need to think about the workers who might be affected in such scenarios, such as those who review videos or create video content for their job. And we'd also have to think about the different socio-economic backgrounds to ensure inclusivity. So given this is complex, we will require robust evidence bases that will help inform policymakers on these decisions. So that's what we can do in terms of watching demand, but what about this idea of designing for sufficiency? So I had some initial ideas from the household study, but I really wanted to explore this in more detail with participants. So to explore this area, I conducted a design workshop with participants on designing for moderate and meaningful digital experiences. And this again was conducted in the UK, in March 2019 with 13 participants. And this involved individual reflections on participants' internet use, table discussions surrounding good and bad aspects of the internet and how the internet is embodied in their everyday lives, and also a design exercise to develop technologies or things that will help users have more moderate and meaningful interactions with digital devices and online services. And the design exercise involved storyboarding, and the participants alongside the researchers had lots of interesting different ideas about how technology might encourage moderate and meaningful interactions. So for example, this idea by one participant, which involved reducing the user experience on a service by reducing the colour and the brightness on social media gradually the more time that they use it, in the idea that this would make kind of the interaction less appealing over time and therefore prompt the user to stop using the service. But these weren't always service related, as one participant discussed this idea of having a fidget spinner phone case where the operating system would prompt them to interact with the back of the case if they were spending a lot of time online as a way just to pass time. And I analysed all the design workshop session data and found that their designs could be formed into specific themes surrounding kind of providing feedback and awareness of use and suggesting alternatives to those use, like the fidget spinner, setting limits to use, for example, at specific times of the day, utilising physical and spatial aspects of the user, such as location data, to adapt access to services, building on things in the real world, such as competition with others and gamification, reducing the user experience of devices or services, such as that colour and brightness example I just gave then, and even combining these themes into more integrative designs. So given all this data, analysis and findings from both the workshop and the household study, what are the opportunities for HCI to design for more moderate and meaningful digital experiences that might help reduce data demand and break the Cornucopian paradigm? So I analysed this data collectively in detail and offer 4 potential design recommendations for the HCI community within kind of 2 overarching themes. So with the first theme, and this builds on work in HCI, particularly work in the digital wellbeing space on creating flows, frictions and flows to interactions. So making it harder for users to start an online interaction and then easier for them to exit one. So for example, you might create internet speed bumps to increase loading times on devices, or they might be more physical, like having access to the internet in certain rooms or locations through signal blockers, all to remove these kind of impulse actions and prevent the consumption of devices and traffic. Or you might automatically close an app after a certain amount of time, so kind of prompting the user that it might be a good time to move on to something else and avoid any more user-initiated traffic consumption from that action. We might also meddle with different layers of services. So for like I mentioned before, we might strip back layers of service. For example, for moderate watching, we might only show standard definition content instead of high definition content. Or we might offer stripped back versions of social media whereby only textual data is displayed, kind of removing this additional demand from video content and other more data intensive media. Or we might even add metadata layers whereby data is overlaid on top of a service. So this may be used to inform users about how long they've been on a service, so kind of linking back to that feedback and awareness design, and kind of to encourage them to spend less time based on that information. All the overlay data might even inform users on how their data is being used in the moment on the service. So I haven't gone into too much detail in the slideshow, but for some of the participants, they discussed issues of trust and online privacy with services. And so kind of making this data more available about what the service is actually doing behind the scenes, users might then be able to make better decisions about what they do and what they share. And with all these design recommendations, there were overlaps between sustainability and reducing data demand to more user-orientated benefits surrounding digital wellbeing, work productivity, online privacy, and relationships with others. And in fact, some of the designs for the moderate and meaningful service use from participants in the workshop actually already exist in the form of digital wellbeing tools, but they just don't always integrate this kind of toggling of internet access required to prevent data demand. So we should take a much more holistic approach for innovating responsibly across such areas, as a lot of the findings and implications could interlink. And I've put on the slide, but myself and Daniel Pargman wrote about the interlinks between these different areas in our paper called Breaking the Cornucopian Paradigm at Limits in 2019. So if you're interested in seeing more detail about the overlaps with these different literatures, then please check that out. And one thing throughout all of this that I've not really discussed are the challenges that we face in this domain. And yet these have been such a big part of discussion and reflection of my work to date. And these will probably be super relevant to you all in thinking about innovating technology responsibly too. So I'll just give you a quick overview of a couple of the challenges I've been thinking about. An important one is the technical and implementation problems to this work. So firstly, in terms of getting a complete picture of data demand, and secondly, in actually being able to intervene with it. So for example, it's not currently possible on iOS or Android to both log data usage and deploy an internet intervention through Wi-Fi and mobile data toggling. So even trying to run an app continuously in the background for logging is difficult, as iOS, for example, only allows specific services to do this, such as location services. And you could get around such restrictions by accessing data usage and intervening at the router level, like I've done in my studies. But this comes with its own set of issues surrounding understanding how network data interlinks to what users do, and also conducting this type of work at a large scale. Another important challenge is how we might get businesses on board. So given less data doesn't always correspond with the business models of some companies. So for example, some mobile service providers offer internet binging deals, which offer more data to users for free on specific services. So how do we make it more appealing for companies to offer less data binging deals? And this is where policy can come in a little, as I mentioned before, but we should collaborate with businesses and find ways in which more moderate use of services and devices can work for users, companies, and the environment. And there's also this issue of unintended effects or rebound effects from creating data demand interventions. So for example, if we were to reduce the amount someone might stream at home, what would they do instead? So in the utopian scenario, the swapped activity would be much less carbon intensive, but we can't be sure, because what if they did something worse, like driving a car? So streaming would then of course be the ideal activity in such a comparison. And same goes for the long-term effects of technology beyond sustainability. So for example, there are apps out there now that make certain apps inaccessible during specific times to help people concentrate on work, relationships, or for other well-being purposes. So if we piggybacked off this type of design for internet demand reductions, the fit to the user, what if in the long term these designs became more controlled by users' employers? It could be seen as a way to help people concentrate on their work, but actually more control is in the technology and in employers' hands. So I reflect on some of these kind of long-term unintended effects that could happen for digital wellbeing technologies in a paper I wrote for the Nordic HCI conference. So do check that out if you're interested. But basically what I'm trying to say is that through responsible innovation, we really need to totally understand that in that moment, that an internet intervention is important, worthwhile, and the right thing to do for the user and the environment. And I wanted to end on a bit of reflection, really. So when I went to present the watching research at CHI, which is the conference for HCI, I felt really ill at a workshop, which meant for the first day of the conference was a bit of a write-off for me. So instead, I streamed the opening keynote, and for some of the talks I wanted to attend, despite being only a 10-minute walk from the conference building. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the internet and video streaming in particular for staying in touch with family and friends having meetings, conferences, and events like this summer school has been incredibly important for many people worldwide. So I guess with this, I'm trying to highlight that the internet is awesome and it gives us so many benefits in our everyday lives, including inclusion and access. And that's why I believe we need to focus on reducing on what's not important, what can be moderated, and ensure what's meaningful to us isn't reduced, if possible. And that's why I wanted to get you all to think about really is what we can change for issues of sustainability, how those changes benefit us, and what we need to design to ensure technology is sustainable and responsible. And moving forward, much more work needs to be done in the area of sustainable technology design, involving extensive collaboration across academia, industry and policy to ensure that we can kind of reap the benefits of digital technology whilst making sure it's fully sustainable and responsible. So we're actively working in the space at Lancaster. We've got a new project called Paris D, working with multiple universities and industry leaders. And this will all kind of focus on developing an evidence base of ICT's climate impacts, as well as responsible innovation approaches or tools that will help realise net zero emissions targets within and beyond the ICT sector. So if you're interested in finding more about that work and how we could collaborate, please get in touch. And there's also a link on the slide to the press release on that work. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I'd now like to open up to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. It's time for questions. I'm really so the change that COVID brings to this is interesting. Like I think like 2 years ago, I would have been very much a proponent of internet-free zones in our apartment, while now I see that this is just not feasible anymore in a family with 4 people. You just want to have internet everywhere just to have a chance to have a spot where you can do a call or interact with people at the time when it's needed. I want to start the questioning with one thing. Yesterday we had an intervention by Jens Marmodin, who was basically proposing that how did he phrase it? That while the consumption of streaming services in internet is increasing, the overall energy consumption of network traffic and data center consumption is not increasing. So what is your thought on their work in relationship with yours? To what extent do you think your approach or your measures or criteria are valid criteria for sustainability?
Yes, so I mentioned a report right at the beginning of the talk. And this was done by Charlie Freitag et al. Was one of the researchers involved in that. And we did look at Malmöden's study and some other studies that critique ICT's environmental impacts. And yeah, Malmöden is one of the more optimistic researchers that kind of outplays ICT's environmental impacts in the future. And their study, like you said, says that ICT's environmental impacts are kind of stabilising. And I think it's important to realise that even if they do stabilise, ICT's environmental impacts do stabilise, they still become kind of a bigger share of our global emissions overall, if we kind of reduce the rest of the sectors in line with the Paris Agreement. So we do need to still reduce ICT's emissions to kind of make sure that they align with the Paris Agreement. In terms of the streaming side, I think streaming is kind of more one of those examples of how demand has kind of grown over time. And realistically now, I think the more important thing to be focusing on is things like big data and AI and Internet of Things, the kind of new trends that are going to carry on this kind of projected growth, and things like blockchain as well. So yeah, that's kind of where I see the next step of work heading.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, a good one.
From the back.
We'll start with the back for once.
Hi, I'm Lieven Eckhout from Ghent University. A great talk, but I have a question. So all trends show that, well, actually, the main companies that are data-driven, think about the Facebooks and of the world, they really want us to consume more data, right? So how can we change business models for them so that they are on board to become more energy conscious, if you wish?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here. So as I touched on in the talk, I think that there's some needs of the users that they're maybe not meeting. So kind of like the privacy implications and kind of the sharing data aspects around that, and relationships with others, and kind of well-being aspects that companies need to start thinking about. As you would have seen with like the Facebook kind of digital well-being tools that they've started to introduce, whether they actually really want those isn't the question, but that's another debate. Secondly is really policy comes in massively here, because we do need to have regulation that kind of enforces all industry to align with the Paris Agreement and kind of take these considerations more into account. So that there are standards currently by the ITU that it's a way for ICT industries to kind of align with the Paris Agreement, but it's voluntary. And lots of ICT companies out there now don't necessarily have targets that will align with the Paris Agreement, and things like net zero, for example. I think there's only Microsoft that aims to be carbon negative, like as a key ICT industry company. So really, yeah, we do need to kind of work with policymakers and embed this more to make it more kind of actually forced, so that they have to do it. But yeah, and also collaborate with the businesses to kind of find new ways in which that might work for them.
Hi, very interesting presentation, thank you. I had a question about the challenge slide, because I feel there was something that was a little bit missing. I read a book 2 or 3 years ago from Sébastien Boller called The Human Bug, talking about the dopamine pump that we all have in our head. And that dopamine pump has no stop button by design of our brain. Let's put it like that. And obviously, most of the designers within the big Google and other Apple companies, they know that by heart. So they use it like the advertising campaigners use it pretty well. And from my perspective, and I think many others who have read this book, it seems to be even more the biggest challenge, because you can constrain people like Wi-Fi free zones and other tricks to limit, but the brain is very creative and will find ways to get access to more of dopamine inputs, you could say. What can you, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is there other pieces of research that you've seen that can maybe help design creative solutions to this core problem?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Funnily enough, actually, when I wrote some of these papers, I was having a similar thing myself. So I was actually writing about this paper on sustainable streaming, and then binging Breaking Bad on Netflix. So yeah, it's tough. In terms of the dopamine problem specifically, I think there's some research around that within the digital wellbeing space. I don't know it very well myself. It probably linked more with the health side of research. So be interesting to kind of explore that a bit more.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the very inspiring talk. I have a question regarding the various suggestions that you had to limit abusive internet use. So for me, they are quite sensible, but I was wondering if you had any plans to test them out in practice to see if they really work, and if users can work with the suggestions that you made.
Yes, I mean, the ones I had specifically, some of them are starting to kind of get tested and within the digital wellbeing space. We looked into creating some ourselves, and that's when we kind of hit some of these technical challenges on iOS and Android about actually trying to manipulate how people use things. It's quite restrictive. We published that in a paper at Limits about all the kind of operating system restrictions around those things. But yeah, in terms of the research from my side, I think I'll probably work more with the companies themselves and see how that they can actually introduce this, because it's so hard to kind of be on the outside and create some suggestions. So it might not necessarily be those specific internet streaming or kind of well-being designs that we're focused on, but figuring out how we can design technologies more sustainably and responsibly, but with the service providers themselves.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for, I think, one last question.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm also a designer by trade, so I've been a bit familiar with HCI in this field. And during my research, I think I reached the same point as you, as you were mentioning one of your slides, is if you want to actually put on action some limits on consumption on digital services, you might need to break net neutrality, or at least there is a Rubicon to pass at some point. And because if you take out the consumer perspective and you go from the producer perspective and the legal side, you could actually think like we can throttle the IP traffic in France, for example, to 40% maximum will be allocated to Netflix. You know, as much as in French radio, we assume that we only have to 40% of French-speaking program on French radio, so we could actually apply same policies on Netflix in France, but we cannot because net neutrality. So how do you cross the Rubicon on that, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, it's really tough. But I guess, I mean, I don't know if anyone saw, but in the pandemic itself, Netflix did agree with EU regulators to kind of reduce their bandwidth to allow for other workers to access the internet and do video conferencing, etc. So I think there's some kind of trade-offs that we might need to do. We might need to say that some kind of activities are more worthy than others. But it's going down a huge rabbit hole itself there, and we need to kind of do a lot more research about kind of how that would work, and especially with the net neutrality thing, as I mentioned before, with the different kind of people that would be affected if kind of video was to be more expensive. So yeah, that's a good point.
Thanks a lot. It feels to some extent that we are always coming back to discussions around regulation and setting targets for industry sectors. Last question from my side. Do you have an intuition which initiative or which approach to setting such targets is the most reasonable one? Is that, I don't know, science-based targets, or do you have any intuition there?
Yeah, I think we need to have an evidence base of ICT's environmental impacts that takes into full kind of emission scopes that we can then, provide policymakers and industry so that they can actually align their environmental footprint with these. Because I think one of the problems at the moment is that there's not this kind of transparent evidence, and people are talking about ICTs and actually being able to reduce emissions in other sectors without kind of fully considering ICT's own impact. So we really just need to have a total idea about what this evidence is and work with those companies.
All right, thanks a lot. I think we have to kick you out at some point and move over to Elina and hear what she thinks about your PhD.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I hope you enjoy. The talk should be great.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good day, Kelly.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.